Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about Constance Baker Motley, the first African-American woman nominated and confirmed in 1966 to serve as a federal judge. But her story doesn't begin there, nor would it be the first time that she was the first black woman or woman to break any barriers. She was the first female attorney to ever be hired by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she worked closely with Thurgood Marshall. She was the first person to write the original complaint of Brown versus Board of Education, and the first African-American woman to argue cases to the United States Supreme Court, and the first black woman to be elected to the state legislature of New York, and the first woman to become Manhattan Bureau President. For this conversation, I'm very happy to welcome to the program Tomiko Brown-Nagin. Tomiko Brown-Nagin is the Dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute and Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School, and she is the author of the book that we will be in conversation about called Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, and the Struggle for Equality. Tomiko Brown-Nagin, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's interesting to me. I think, like many people, I had never heard the name Constance Baker Motley until her name was brought up by Ketanji Brown Jackson, who now will be the first black woman on the United States Supreme Court. Now, Constance Baker Motley's name is out there, but I think for me, and I think others, now we know her as the first black federal judge, a female federal judge. And it wasn't really until I started preparing for our conversation that I realized how amazing and important and deep her story is, and yet it seems to be lost to cultural amnesia. Not lost to you, however. You've been working on her story for more than 20 years.
Well, for a decade, and I am happy to send this book into the world at such a timely moment and to ensure that new generations of Americans know about Constance Baker Motley. She had a tremendous impact on public life.
It reminded me when we did a show several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, somebody who's, I think, better known now. There's a movie about her, but somebody like Pauli Murray. Again, it was like, how do we not know about someone like this? It was the same experience I had in preparing for our chat. What do you think? I think something that's important to realize is she was actually very well known in her time.
She was. She was well known enough to become a politician. Elected the first black woman to the New York Senate and then to Manhattan Borough President, where she was the first woman. So she had incredible name recognition, which is one of the reasons that the Democratic Party was invited her to stand for election in New York. After she litigated the Meredith case, James Meredith case, where he sued to attend the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. She was profiled in the New York Times and was truly one of the most remarkable, well-known civil rights lawyers in this country. And I think you're moving to a question of, well, why isn't she as well known as she should be? And I would say that mostly it's down to gender and to race, and how in history generally, and including in American history and even in the history of the civil rights movement, the focus has been on male leaders. In fact, I would say leadership has been coded male. And so a lot of women who made invaluable contributions have not been remembered in the way that they should be.
Constance Baker Motley was born on September 14th, 1921 in New Haven, Connecticut. That's where she would grow up. But her story is an immigrant story because her parents were immigrants from the Caribbean. Tell me about her parents.
Happy to. Willoughby and Rachel Baker had immigrated to this country in the early 20th century, landed in New Haven, where there was a small community of West Indian immigrants, and it was a close-knit family, a large family. The parents were socially conservative. They were religious. Interestingly, the father taught Constance and all of her siblings that West Indians were superior to African Americans, and certainly to the Black migrants from the South, who came up like his family had, searching for work. in the cities. And what is that about? Well, it goes back to life in the old country, where he was a part of a class of individuals who literally were called special people because they had acquired some education. He worked as a cobbler, so in a skilled trade, and brought that sense of superiority to America. He was the family was racially mixed, so connected to Europeans. They liked being a part of the British Empire. And so there was just a lot there that marked her, and in ways mostly that were advantageous. She was taught by her father that they were superior, in part because he worked at Yale University. He and most all of her male relatives worked there, where he interfaced with wealthy white young men, and he read their privilege into himself. And so very interesting family story, but one, as I say, that mostly is positive, because all of these teachings had an impact of it was protective for Constance Baker Motley when she became a lawyer and went into some really scary, frightening situations down south when she was litigating many cases.
Wasn't her father a chef for the Skull and Bones Society?
He was at one point
at Yale.
Yeah, so he worked for the Yale eating houses as a chef, and it's just a remarkable story that someone whose father was essentially, he was serving these wealthy students, some of whom would become captains of industry and leaders of government, had a daughter who herself rose to the pinnacle of the federal government in terms of being a federal judge. It's one journalist called it a Cinderella story, which is a really interesting way of putting it, gendered, and yet it captures the sense that she ascended to a place where she really wasn't supposed to be.
Yeah. She did have the benefit of a good education. Was this because of her father's connections?
It actually was not. It was despite her father's understanding and her mother's understanding of the young girl's place. She wanted to go to college from the time she was a teenager, and even to go to law school. And everybody, including her parents, thought that it was just a crazy aspiration for this little Black girl, working class Black girl in New Haven. And yet she did develop that interest as a result of influences, including teachers who introduced her to American classics. She learned about Abraham Lincoln, who was a lawyer. George Crawford was an African-American man who had earned his law degree at Yale, a native of Alabama. He was involved with the NAACP as a collaborator, and so she came to know about the struggle for equality through him. She learned about the writings of W.B. Du Bois, and she ended up being able to go to college and to law school because of the support of a New Haven philanthropist who was a Yale graduate, who came to know her because he heard her speak at a civic association that had been built for Blacks, but evidently not a lot of Black people were showing up. And she gave a great speech that so impressed him that he offered to pay for her college and law school tuition.
Wow. And who was he?
His name was Clarence Blakesley. He was a contractor in New Haven, wealthy philanthropist, again, a graduate of Yale, who supported a lot of, he supported kids at Yale who needed scholarships, and a lot of civic organizations, and also ended up benefiting Constance Baker.
Yeah. Did her family think that they were experiencing racism in Connecticut in the first half of the 20th century? And I ask that because you were talking about their sort of favorability towards the British Empire. Of course, that doesn't mean that they didn't face or feel like they faced racism, but it's also significant that her mom founded the NAACP in New Haven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's an interesting story where Motley herself, the judge, indicates that she didn't experience much racism at all in New Haven, Connecticut, and she also reported that her parents minimized or didn't talk about racism. Class oppression, being impoverished, was a much more salient issue for Constance Baker as she was growing up. And yet there were some instances where she was turned away from a beach in Milford because of her race, evidently. And yet she attended integrated schools. Her neighborhood was integrated. And so certainly as compared to what she went on to challenge in the Deep South, her life was relatively free of the kind of rank racial discrimination that the NAACP challenged in other areas.
Was she committed to civil rights and issues around civil rights before she went to the South, or was the South formative in this?
Well, I would say the answer is both. She was committed to social change. She was an activist teenager involved in all sorts of organizations, including labor organizations, consistent with her concern around class inequality. And that social consciousness eventually flowered into this interest in the struggle for racial justice. And certainly her travels down south initially, when she matriculated to Fisk University, the HBCU in Nashville, made quite an impact on her. She had to switch to the segregated car along her journey to Nashville. It was frightening. It was humiliating, and certainly planted a seed that flowered into her efforts to undermine Jim Crow as a lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And
it's right out of law school at Columbia that she goes to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she's basically she becomes the number 2 attorney there. She's working right behind and probably for and with Thurgood Marshall.
She is. So she was hired by Thurgood Marshall even before she graduated from Columbia Law School. He hired her in 1945 to serve as an intern, and then she joined the office in 1946. There were a handful of other attorneys there. She wasn't immediately the number 2, although she did work with Thurgood Marshall. That came much later over the course of her career. And yet she did have tremendous responsibility. She worked on a variety of cases, ranging from issues of discrimination in the voting system. She represented African-American soldiers who had trouble, court martials, due to activities overseas during the war. And she worked on a number of cases related to education, including pay disparity cases on behalf of Black teachers, and then all of those school desegregation cases as well.
Yeah, and again, as I said in the introduction, she was the first one to write a complaint concerning Brown versus the Board of Education decision.
She wrote the original complaint in the Brown cases, and that was significant. And then after that, she conducted research and helped to write the briefs in the Brown cases, and was there when the Inc. Fund, as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was called, began its effort to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that had condoned separate but equal in American life.
What was her relationship like to Thurgood Marshall?
Yeah, so Marshall was very impressed with her. As I mentioned, he hired her on the spot. He thought that she was a great lawyer. In fact, he helped to train her to be a great lawyer, and was very supportive of her. The reality is that although Motley certainly was committed to social justice work, she also had the doors closed in her face by white men partners in the lucrative private law firm sector of the legal profession when she applied. And so Marshall was progressive and supportive of her when he hired her, a woman in 1945, and for all but a short period of time, she was the only woman on the staff at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. There had been a woman hired before her, woman lawyer hired before her, who then left, and so she was there by herself, the only woman working in a very high pressure environment for some 20 years.
My understanding is that with the Legal Defense Fund, once Thurgood Marshall left to join the Supreme Court, she was the number 2 attorney at the time, but she was passed over for replacing.
Really top job. Once Marshall was appointed to the Second Circuit, he eventually was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, the first African-American justice. But that was a moment of, this was in 1961, a setback for Motley. She thought that she deserved to be considered for Marshall's position, as did other African-American attorneys. She thought gender was a factor in her not being selected, race was a factor, and yet she always was grateful to Thurgood Marshall for supporting her career, saying that had it not been for Thurgood Marshall, no one ever would have heard of Constance Baker Motley. Yeah. And after, she didn't get the number 1 spot, but as you say, she was the number 2.
Yeah. And race may have played a part, is because the person who would replace Thurgood Marshall was a white man.
That's right. Jack Greenberg, who was, a loyal lieutenant of Thurgood Marshall, dedicated to the cause, terrific lawyer, and he was a terrific head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So far as I have explored that, the thrust of the book is really about centering Motley and her worldview and vision. And so I don't, in discussing her being passed over for Thurgood Marshall's position, it's really not a commentary on the person who did achieve that position, but rather her sense of disappointment. And on the race issue, one has to appreciate that this is 1961. So just a few years, 6 years after Brown versus Board of Education was decided, when African-American lawyers simply did not have the stature that they would go on to have. And so it was thought that surely the head of the Inc. Fund would be another Black lawyer. That's not how it turned out.
Yeah. She would argue 10 cases to the United States Supreme Court, winning 10 of them. Maybe that one that she did not immediately win eventually was overturned. You will clarify.
That's right. So she initially won 9 of the 10, which is a tremendous record. And she's the first Black woman known to have argued at the Supreme Court, and argued a range of cases, including on behalf of criminal defendants, protesters, just a wide variety of cases, and was just an excellent lawyer, and so calm and so knowledgeable about the case law, because she and the other Inc. Fund lawyers had made the law, right? So they actually created the civil rights laws, and she was a terrific lawyer.
One of these important cases that you begin your book about is efforts to desegregate the University of Mississippi in 1962. This is James Meredith's case.
Right. So that case, the Ole Miss case, was the culmination of a number of cases where she helped to desegregate higher education in the South. She was the lawyer in the Clemson case, University of Alabama, the University of Georgia. I think it's safe to say that the Ole Miss case was the most challenging because the state of Mississippi was the most racist state. Terribly dangerous for her to have traveled to Mississippi all of those times to litigate the cases. In fact, her friend and colleague, Medgar Evers, who's the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, was murdered, was assassinated a month after Motley left Mississippi after winning that case. And so her life was under threat, and she worked so hard to ensure that Meredith was able to matriculate at Ole Miss, including morphing from a legal tactician to sort of a therapist, because it was so hard on James Meredith as he was the standard bearer, the face of the struggle for desegregation in Mississippi. Wow, what a tremendous role to play. He was said to have a messianic zeal about it, and yet there were times when his spirit flagged when he was the plaintiff in that case, and Motley had to help him go on.
Yeah, the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Mm.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute and Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. We are in conversation about her book, Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, and the Struggle for Equality. Did she leave behind, and was she very expressive about her experiences through this period of time?
Well,
journals or writings or interviews or whatever it may be?
Sure. So in order to recreate her life and explore what her internal life might have been like, I had to find, just every interview, every scrap of paper. Certainly relied on her autobiography to figure out what she was going through, and how she felt about some of these really challenging moments. And I was able to establish that she was afraid at many moments for her life. She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to see her son and her husband again. She missed her family when she was on the road, traveling to the South. And also, there were moments where she faced a lot of racial hostility from opposing counsel, and she was not happy about that either. And I thought it was important in this book to explore all of those matters, not just talk about the legal cases, but to talk about the human being who was fighting this battle under such trying circumstances.
The title of your book, Civil Rights Queen, the word queen, I suspect, is quite deliberate.
That's right. So the Civil Rights Queen was a term that a Black journalist who saw Motley argue one of the cases in the South used to describe her. And I thought it captured her reality that few people had seen a Black lawyer or a woman lawyer, and she was this incredible combination of a Black woman lawyer. And she fascinated people and startled people, and just inspired complicated reactions. And so the Civil Rights Queen moniker really bespoke how she transcended her lawyerly role and was an icon of the struggle for equality. So the Queen was a term of endearment and affection for her, playing on royalty, obviously, which is neat given the family's affection for the British crown.
The way she held herself and conducted herself in public was very important to her. Very deliberate.
It was. She was always well dressed. She was reserved. She, as I described in the book, she wore a mask because she had been taught by Thurgood Marshall, and certainly would have learned this anyway in her life, that you never should divulge your emotion. Certainly not anger or sadness. Never let them see you sweat. And so that's the way she moved through the world. She was a striking person, physically striking, almost 6 feet tall. And she carried herself in a way that was, she thought, demanded by her singularity in the world.
So in the early 1960s, she's working as an attorney, oftentimes arguing cases to the United States Supreme Court. It's not until 1966 that she's nominated to the federal bench by Lyndon Johnson. We'll get to that in a moment. But there's an in-between period here that's really important, because is it a correct reading to look at it as she leaves legal work to go towards electoral politics? Because she would become the first African-American woman to be elected to New York State legislature.
To the New York Senate, and this is in 1960.
Is it 64?
64, that's right, 64. And then she's elected Manhattan Borough President in 1965. Initially, she did not have to leave her job at the Legal Defense Fund. When she was in the Senate, that's just a part-time job. The Manhattan Borough President required much more of her. It was an important position, policymaking, a role through which she could affect policy through budgetary powers. It was ceremonial. And I do think it was an important part of her professional career, not only because of the firsts, but because she was able to occupy that branch of government that is involved in making law and policy. And so more so than many judges, she understood the difference between being an advocate and being a lawmaker, and then being a judge interpreting the law, which is true. Nevertheless, she had a pretty hard time when she was nominated to the bench, with some saying that she was an inappropriate candidate.
As a state legislator, and you were correct to point out how the nature of state legislatures have changed over time. They used to be part-time things, and at least here in California, I suspect same in Albany, but maybe I'm wrong. In California, it's really a full-time job now that they do. But as a state senator, her focus was on her main focus was on housing.
Well, I would say that in her role in the legislature, both the state Senate position, but then also her priorities as Manhattan Borough President, were really to ensure equality through a different realm. So she was in the Senate. She opposed no-knock bills that gave police officers the ability to enter people's homes without a warrant. She was concerned about police abuse. She was concerned and supported funding for social programs to support those who were of modest means. So she was taking sort of the next step in the struggle for equality by spending time in government as a legislator and in the borough presidency. And so she lived just such a full life. There are few people who can say that their commitments to equality have found expression in such distinct professional roles. Constance Baker Motley could say that.
And what would it mean? What did it mean to be the president of the bureau of a borough? And for her, it was the Manhattan Borough.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, it's a ceremonial role where she represented the borough of Manhattan. Lots of ribbon cuttings and interactions with civic groups and churches, But the most important aspect of the job, by far, I would say, was that she sat on the board of estimate, and in that position was able to shape the budget of the city, and that was very important way of, again, ensuring that constituents, the range of constituents, including those who were lower income, who were people of color, could have their needs met by the city.
Yeah. And then the nomination to the federal bench, this is by Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1966. Did she have a relationship to President Johnson beforehand?
Well, she was a politician, and she was known to him because she was known to the Democratic Party in New York, which actually asked Johnson to hold off on the nomination because they wanted her to stand for the borough presidency position. So not a personal relationship, although she admired him and the Great Society, and credited him for making real the dream of equality in fact, including through her appointment to the federal bench.
Is there a push at this time to diversify the bench?
Well, I think that's probably overstating the case. Johnson wanted to appoint qualified women and African Americans and Hispanics to high governmental posts, and he was able to do that. But it was far from a critical mass of people appointed. That would not come until the presidency of Jimmy Carter.
And you said there was controversy over her nomination.
Well, the controversy, first of all, there was a great deal of support for her nomination. She was thoroughly vetted by the Johnson White House and was praised by federal judges, Supreme Court justices included, and leaders in the civil rights movement. The trouble came from segregationists and who thought that as a civil rights lawyer, she couldn't be fair to everyone. Which what they really meant is that she actually would be fair in the discrimination cases in particular. That was a claim that was made. James Eastland, who was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, claimed that she was a communist and held up her nomination for 7 months. And even there were those in the New York bar who there was no tradition of African Americans getting those high posts, and they were not exactly jumping up and down in favor of it either.
Did Johnson have to get involved to push her nomination forward?
Sure, and he backed down from his original goal, which was to nominate her to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Because of that pushback, she was nominated to the lower court, to the United States District Court in Manhattan, instead of to the Second Circuit.
Oh, so originally she was nominated to the Second Circuit? Or that was the idea? He wanted to do that.
That was the idea.
Do it.
Yes,
yeah.
That did not come to pass.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the step before you get to the Supreme Court, the circuits.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And her confirmation, was it close vote? Was it?
It was a voice vote, and James Eastland abstained. So it was not close. And in fact, the notion of close confirmation votes is really a byproduct of recent decades.
Times. Yeah, more of our own era than then. Did she ever take up cases that somehow, maybe not in the particular case because there might be a conflict of interest, but did she take up civil rights cases? Did she judge civil rights cases on the bench?
Sure, just like every other judge. Yeah. The cases were assigned by lottery. There was a spin of the wheel in the Southern District of New York, and so a judge's name was drawn, and a case was assigned that way. And so she did preside in important civil rights cases, including one where she cited for Melissa Luckey, who was a female sports journalist who wanted to enter the Major League Baseball clubhouses to cover, in this case, the New York Yankees, to cover the World Series. She was denied. She sued and prevailed in Motley's courtroom. It was a deeply controversial case. I don't know if you're a baseball fan,
yes,
but
I am.
People just had a lot of feelings about what was proper and improper in the context of that sport, really any professional sport. And so a lot of hackles were raised. What Motley indicated in her opinion was that, sure, the ball players have privacy rights, but let them wear towels. Like the choice isn't between having their privacy violated and having Melissa Luckey in the locker room. Both things can happen. And so that was one of her great cases. And there were many others. I'm happy to talk about them if you'd like.
But that case specifically would hold up in other reviews in the higher courts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, although it was controversial in public life, with journalists writing a lot about it and stacks of mail coming into her chambers with people complaining about it. Second Circuit did uphold her.
And she would also serve for her court, the chief judge, until her death. When that obviously
not until her death. The chief judge served, I believe, at that time for maybe 5 years, and it was a ceremonial role. She did serve as chief judge and continued to handle cases well after she had taken senior status at 20 years on the bench. She stayed on and continued to work in her chambers for many, many years. She was a workaholic, as her law clerks said, but just dedicated to the job and found it very meaningful.
You also write about something that, in quote, James Baldwin, and this idea of the price of the ticket, of what does it mean to be somebody from the outside who is trying to make change, to suddenly being in the inside of the government, and as she would be as a federal judge. Talk to me about this dynamic and her career.
Sure. Well, the price of the ticket is that there are personal costs to being a first. There are expectations, great weight on her. And when she was appointed to the bench, women's rights and civil rights groups thought that it was just fantastic to have one of their own on the bench, that the quality of justice meted out had to improve with Constance Baker Motley on the bench. And so there was that expectation, and yet it didn't always turn out that way, because being a judge is not the same as being an advocate. So sometimes the plaintiffs in discrimination cases won, sometimes, most often, they didn't. In her courtroom, just the same as in other jurist courtrooms, there are a lot of factors that bear upon whether a plaintiff is able to prevail in court, and that was true for her as it was for other judges. And so the price of the ticket also is meant to suggest that marginalized groups should not assume that having these symbols of the group in high places is necessarily going to translate to their interests being represented. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
Did that cause disappointment by civil rights activists at the time?
Sometimes, not always. Just, she was on the bench for 39 years, so decided a lot of cases, and there were some where she decided in ways that definitely provoked comment in the civil rights community, but others were cases that they liked. So just a mixed bag, which is what I would expect.
Tomiko Brown-Nagin has been our guest. Again, she is the Dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute and the Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. And she has joined us for a conversation on her book. It's called Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. Tomiko Brown-Nagin, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you for having me on the show.